Next up, we have Mr. Hector Figueroa, President of SEIU 32BJ. Mr. Figueroa, great to see you again. Hope you had a good New Year.
Yeah, great to see you too, and good morning to you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Martins, and all members of the Standing Labor Committee, and Happy New Year to us all in this room.
Amen.
Feliz Año Nuevo. So I understand that you have a copy of our testimony. So I'm going to make some references here and there to some aspects of it, and then I would like Jamil Mitchell, which is one of our security officers who is currently employed at the New York Public Library System, and he earns $11 an hour, to relate to you his personal experience and his thoughts as to why raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would make a big difference to workers like him.
Thank you.
So,
welcome.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Why don't you start, and then I will compliment you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Senators. Yes, like you said, my name is Jamil Mitchell, and I work with the NYPL Library in New York City, and I'm glad to be a part of this campaign for the Fight for 15. And it's about money. Yeah, money is important, but it's also about the livelihood and in the community and our families. Is affected by this too. And I just want to say that thanks to everyone who's in support for this, and I hope that we all get it together for the whole New York State, not just the city, the state as a whole. And I'd like to thank you for your time and patience, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
And I'm sure Jamil will be open to questions after I make a brief introduction.
Of course.
Thank you. So first of all, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I found both the previous testimonies, both by my brother George Gresham from 1199 and by E.J. McMahon from the Empire State Policy Center, very illuminating and helpful, and it speaks to the depth and to the interest of this committee of really examining the question of raising the minimum wage statewide to $15 an hour as being a serious endeavor. And I want to thank you for that. From the perspective of Local 32BJ, and I like to give some background on us. We are a union that is along the East Coast. Our jurisdiction goes beyond New York. We have 145,000 members that go from New Hampshire all the way to Florida. So we have experience in many multiple markets with many multiple rates, with many different initiatives, whether they are in Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Philadelphia recently for airport workers, about raising wages for low-wage workers. We are incredibly proud of the 75,000 members that are here in New York State and what we have accomplished over 80 years through collective bargaining. Since 1934, our union has been able to negotiate good jobs that pay living wages, provide benefits, and doing it in the process of bargaining with the real estate industry in the state, but also largely in downstate in the city. We have been coming to these hearings precisely from having bargained new contracts for 45,000 workers in the greater New York metro area, not just New York, but also Connecticut, New Jersey. And those contracts have provided for raises for workers that go as high as almost $27 an hour, in New York City, and have injected into our economy $500 million in new money, whether it goes to wages, health insurance, pension, and if you multiply that in the way that economists calculate, probably to over $2.2, $2.3 billion to the greater New York City metro area. So we come to this hearing, we hope, with the background of having been working on this issue from the collective bargaining side, but also as part of a movement, the Fight for 15, that while it began among fast food workers that courageously went on strike in 2012 in New York City, largely with the support of SEIU and many community activists here, Made the Road, Citizen Action, New York Communities for Change, many others. These workers really essentially were able to captured the imagination of the country, because by the time that they took action, it had become very apparent that income inequality is one of the biggest challenges that our country, I would say also our state, our city face at this moment. The Economic Policy Institute has established that New York State is second only to Connecticut in the polarization on income, the income gap that exists for any other state. So it is that preoccupation, the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor has grown so severely over the last 30, 20 years, plus the erosion in the earnings of workers that bring us here today, I believe, to this hearing, but because workers took action on the street and demanded 15, just like predecessors, many decades, a century before, demanded an 8-hour working day at a moment that people were working 12, 10, 16, 18 hours a day. So I want to look at the poetry for a moment, understanding that prose is a way that we enact law, because the poetry is what compels us to have these hearings, is what compels us to act, is what helps us to discover the humanity and the travails and the challenges that workers at Jamil face, and that we keep that element as we direct the prose to what course of action we take. We have been experiencing in 32BJ significantly the impact of raising wages. In Washington, D.C., and it's part of our testimony, we raised the wages for security officers. The wages went up $6 an hour. Workers there provided testimony, like Jamil here today. One worker in mine was Chanta Jennifer, who I want to quote her because I believe he should capture the sentiment of workers who are going to be the subject of this bill if we successfully pass it. She said at the time, testifying in D.C., "I am proud to be part of the city's defense system as a security officer, but at the time, my wage of $8.24 an hour, I cannot support my 3-year-old son, and that's really all that we ask for." Likewise, workers that are demanding $15 an hour today in New York State, that's all that they're asking for, is to recognize the value of the work and to recognize that they need to make ends meet and that they have to be able to work for a living without being constantly having to balance out whether they buy medicine, whether they pay the rent, whether they buy the goods, to have food at the table, balancing out so many needs, some of them finding themselves in shelter home because they cannot afford for themselves and their families. So that's clearly the problem at hand, and I know that this committee, each and one of you, where you may have a different view of how to solve the problem, I come here with the assumption and the belief, and by looking at your trajectory as legislators, that you care about that problem, and that it's not that you ignore that reality. When we passed the wage increase for security officers in Washington, D.C., the impact that we experienced was that the economy, the market absorbed that increase, that there were no reductions in the level of employment of security officers. There were no security companies that found themselves unable to meet the demand. They were able to meet the increase. The same experience we had when we raised wages through organizing workers among workers in New Jersey, where workers were making about $6 an hour in 2001, and through the efforts of 32BJ, they are now beyond the $15 an hour that we are discussing here at the table, and yet the market absorbed that. They continue to work, and the way that many of the businesses reacted was by increasing productivity, by organizing the workforce in a different way, by trying to provide the same service, perhaps charging a little more, or perhaps charging the same amount, but finding other areas in their operation where they could compensate for the increase in wages. We also have the other reality that beginning this movement, not only fast food workers, but also home care workers, some of whom were here or may still be here in the room, airport workers, have been making the demand for 15. And I know that one of the questions that you raised before is, why 15? Why not some other number? We can find many rationales for this. But I would say if we were in 1963, and Dr. King were testifying here, and by no means I'm pretending to be Dr. King, but I do believe that workers like Jamil is what Dr. King had in mind when he had the march in Washington in 1963. One of the demands of that march was an increase of the minimum wage to $2 an hour. $2 an hour, and I did it here while waiting to do the testimony. In the BLS calculator, Senator, that you encourage everyone to use, and I think it's a very valuable tool, is $15.51. Dr. King was fighting for $15 an hour for low-wage workers.
Got it.
We are about to be celebrating his birthday in 2 weeks. Dr. King would have used both poetry and prose to say that $2 then, $15 now, it is the kind of money that when you put it in the hands of workers at Jamil, can make a difference for themselves, for their families, for their communities, provide more than a minimum level of living. And that is 2015 on the BLS calculator. I didn't do it for 2018. I imagine it will be a little higher than 1551. So this is all to say that as legislators, while looking at the balance and the cost, the cost and the opportunity that this presents, balancing out all different perspectives, I strongly encourage, from the experience of our union in raising wages and witnessing through collective bargaining, that the economy adjusts to that, to the experience, the life experience of workers like Jamil, and to the dream of Dr. King and an entire movement to do the right thing, to pass this legislation. It increases it gradually, and there will be other things. I would be very happy to work with you, and our members will be very happy to work with you, whether it is an earned income tax credit, whether it is child care support, whether it is affordable housing, whether it is helping businesses survive. In my neighborhood in Jackson Heights, it is not wages that is driving small businesses away. It is increasing in rent. It is increasing in insurance. It is, quite frankly, a code of regulating businesses that should be looked at as to what businesses can and cannot do to make sure that it's up to date to the digital era and to the way that businesses operate. So I believe that those things are very important. But doing that overall package to help low-wage workers should not get in the way of doing what is most needed, what is immediate, what compelled Dr. King to march and hundreds of thousands to march in 1963, and that is a $15 an hour minimum wage.
Hector, always great to see you. We had an opportunity to participate in a panel about a month ago, and there was something that you said that struck, and we can continue to use the poetry and prose analogy if you'd like, but you said back then that we wouldn't be having this discussion if it wasn't for the poetry of this fight for 15. And that's true. We're here having a discussion about minimum wage. We're having a discussion about the working poor. We're having a discussion about earned income tax credits. We're having a discussion about safety net programs. We're having a discussion about so many of those things that we should be having a discussion on because of that effort. Now, I value that. I think that the importance of that discussion is there. I also think it's rather poetic that you were able to check that Martin Luther King Jr.'s effort for $2 back in 1963 is $15.50 now, but it's appropriate because it's a fight that continues. So one of the issues, and Senator Cedino brought it up earlier, is there value in tagging this to inflation going forward? Is there a value in our doing that so that we're not obviously moving by leaps and steps periodically and sporadically? Because frankly, if I hear anything from the business community, aside from obviously their concern about this and the not-for-profit community, it's that these increases and the amount of these increases is a real concern for them. And for many of them, we'll put them out of business. And so if we have the ability of phasing in those increases incrementally, it gives the business community, I believe, and the not-for-profit community a much better opportunity to absorb them over time. And so is that something you're advocating for?
Well, it depends what the base is that we start from and what the policy goal is. If the policy goal is to maintain the value of labor, so to speak, right, the hourly pay not taking into account compensation, benefits, paid leave, and other things that are assumed are somehow provided, right, either by the employer or maybe the worker is able to cause himself or herself. The inflation cost of living adjustment could make some sense, but there are other criteria that you may also want to consider as a legislator. What you want to do sometimes is to look at the moment in which the economy is, the kind of needs that need to be provided, and then do an adjustment accordingly. That's why the process of raising the minimum wage is not a purely mathematical operation. You know, there is poetry, there is prose, and then there is mathematics. And I'm glad that it's not a pure mathematic operation because the historic needs change,
Hector,
right?
if you start talking about Common Core,
Yeah, no, but well, that falls into a different category. I'm not going to mention what that category of language that goes into. But I would say you need to look at increases in productivity. You need to look at what workers need in an economy where people increasingly depend on others to take care of the children because both spouses in a household work. That brings a different kind of minimum wage need. Than in an economy where that is less of a reality. There are wage differentials among workers. If collective bargaining succeeds and there is a rebound on labor, or if you look just at New York, should you use the inflation rate or should you use the average collective bargaining settlements and then establish a raise in the minimum wage based on what the average collective bargaining agreements, bring forth, what Peter Ward negotiates, what George negotiates, what we negotiate, and then looking at the distance between that and the minimum wage. So I would say there is not a simple answer. I am in favor of having additional increases from a base that makes sense to us. $15 an hour by 2018 is a sufficient phase-in. You asked a question earlier too. What is the living wage today? That depends on how many dependents you have. That depends on where you live, right? I see Senator Sabino knows about this because we work with so many.
Are you a single parent? Are you a two-income
Exactly.
household? How many children do you have? What are
Exactly, yeah. And if you use an MIT calculator, again, that's a good thing about not being the first one to testify. I can check that in my iPhone. It can go from $22, $23 to as big as $42 an hour if you're a single parent in Long Island, Nassau County, or on the Northern Fork.
I know it.
I
yes.
know. That's what I'm using that example. It could be as high as $42 an hour for a parent with 3 children that depend on that one income. So again, what we are looking at is, to me, it is not going to be a practical, timely enterprise to arrive to a very logically, very well-grounded 98% R-squared equation of certainty of what the number should be. I think that we need to respond to the fact that, $15 an hour is a policy that is gaining momentum in the country, that $15 an hour happens to be a number that it is where 64 million workers in this country are, almost 50% of workers in this country are earning $15 or less. That is a number that, based on the standard cost of living, based on the activity of the fast food workers, is a number that finds its way into the economy. I would argue, and I have said this to City and State with Gerson Borrero, that the number eventually will have to become higher, but there are many ways in which it can become higher. If we grant workers greater ability to bargain with their employers without fear of being intimidated by coming together and negotiating contracts, if we provide a safety net of training, of upgrading productivity and skills, if we address the problems of affordable housing and access to education, the number will go up. And you know what? That will be good for our economy. Because a low-growth economy, if the way that the small businesses in my neighborhood or on the Northern Fork are going to survive is on the dependence, and I like to use the term dependence almost as a substance abuse term, on low-wage work, we're not going to get to that economy. That is an economy that is a high-growth economy where people can afford to pay more for the donut at the bakery, around the corner, or to pay a little bit more for groceries, or be able to afford higher child care. How do we get to that economy that sustains high wages and the ability for people to be paid for the true value of the service they provide It's a challenge, but I think raising the minimum wage to 15 is actually a step in the right direction of getting to that economy. But I agree with you that it would require many other things, from collective bargaining to training.
And you're absolutely right, and I agree with you. I often say that, in this thing we do here, which is trying to set public policy, we need to play chess, and we have to stop playing checkers. It's not one-dimensional. You have to take a 360-degree view of an issue from the standpoint of that low-wage worker, and then remove yourself and go to that small business person and take a 360-degree view from that person and their opportunity to continue to run that business and employ those people. And then we got to come back and look at it from the perspective of the large multinational corporations that frankly may have the ability to absorb it, so they're going to be less likely to be opposed to something like this. But we have to look at different perspectives, and I certainly appreciate the perspective that you bring to our discussion here. Now, you're an employee of the library.
I'm not exactly an employee of the library. I'm contracted through the library. I work at the library through.
Okay.
He works for a private contractor, employee of the public library.
Yeah, my business I work for is actually Spartan Security, contracted through the library. So.
Very well. So your employer is contracted with
The library.
the library.
Mm-hmm.
And would that be covered through any policies that the city may have with respect to setting living wages? Because I know that there was an effort that the city has had to set living wages for their contracted services. Is there a way that can happen? Because one of the efforts that we've also discussed, and it's come up a couple of times today, is there is the ability of local communities, whether they're counties or whether they're cities, to also set in their own way certain minimum wages or living wage requirements. How does that work?
I'm not exactly sure, but I can find out. I don't know.
No worries. We can always look it up.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you being here, and thank you very much for that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Savino.
Of course. Thank you, Senator Martins. Thank you, Hector, for your testimony. I've known you probably longer than anybody on this panel up here.
We were very young then.
We were very young. Very young and idealistic. And we still are. But I just want to hit on 2 points, because you have been involved in both the fight for 15 for fast food workers and the fight for airport workers. All of them are contracted, and you represent this young man who's a security guard, now working for a company that's contracted to the public library, which opens up a whole other issue about wage stagnation and wage depression that's occurred over the past 25 years, and what I believe has been, the privatization of what used to be government jobs to contracted agencies that depress wages, and you're picking up the slack for them, and rightfully so. And thank God for.
In the case of CUNY, we raised wages so high that CUNY in-house the work back.
Right. 30 years ago, he would have been likely to work for the public library as a city employee. So you're now coming in and lifting workers up, and again, rightfully so. It's because I think one of the things I've seen in the Fight for 15 campaign, as well as the the Port Authority, the campaign against the Port Authority, is the workers usually carry signs that say, $15 an hour and a union. Yeah. Now, some people think that they don't have the right to join a union, which in fact they do. They're neither farm workers or domestic workers or independent contractors. But the impediments to unionization or joining a union are pretty difficult to overcome, even in a state like New York. So do you think part of this fight for 15 across the workforce should also involve a discussion about whether it's card check neutrality, is something we talked about years ago, and when nobody really hears that much anymore, or ways that we can make it easier for workers to band together for mutual aid and protection so that they can negotiate at the bargaining table, lifting that ceiling that we talk about. Do you think there are things that we can do in this conversation that will address that as well?
I think there's things in this conversation that should address that. I believe that the passage of the minimum wage law for $15 an hour statewide should not be held upon having that discussion, but I certainly agree with you that it needs to be. We need to look at our procurement practices. At our procurement practices, using the power of government to really make sure that contractors of government services or providers of services and goods to the government are acting responsibly toward the workers. Not only, cases of avoiding like wage theft and exploitation, but even respect for labor rights and respect for civil rights of the workers that they represent. And a stronger government asking that, to me, makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense to me on both sides of the aisle. It is not an issue, again, of left or right. It's an issue of right or wrong, because government should be using its power to make sure that the private sector determination of wages through collective bargaining and the process of workers exercising their rights when they are respected, is not going to be interfered by government to suppress it even more, right? Sometimes the practices of buying services are exactly doing that. They're undermining, what in some sectors is being negotiated in the private sector. So yeah, it's something to look at. I also believe that we should take a look at, how companies, small businesses are really participating or not on the millions, sometimes billions of dollars that government makes available to them. Is it our experience, what goes beyond the scope of this hearing? I'll be happy to talk to you about that some small businesses are actually not getting the aid that you all legislate or the federal government, and that corporations, said companies, said multiple ways of operating that capture those dollars, capture those tax, subsidies and credits, and they are ultimately the ones who benefit and not the intended party. I also think that our tax system should be looked into. Working people carry most of the burden. Many corporations pay very little. But back to the question of collective bargaining, it will be an interesting discussion to have on how we can address workers that are excluded, like farm workers. We are 100% in support of initiatives that have come before this body and the Assembly and the governor in the past. Sometimes they have succeeded, sometimes they haven't, to help farm workers, domestic workers. We did a good measure of advancement in their interest. If you look also at those group of workers, taxi workers, and you increase protections for them, that also helps send the message, right, that workers' rights need to be protected in the places where they are actually eligible for collective bargaining. But I would say that kind of more proactive government may appear as big government to folks who worry, and that's why government works, because you have the yin-yang of government. But it's not really about big government. It's about making sure that there is a level playing field for everybody, and that government, instead of either being indifferent or making the level playing field harder for some, make sure that everybody plays by the rules.